and welcome to Media 7. I'm Russell Brown. Earlier this month, the Howard League for Penal Reform held an event to launch its new Wellington branch and press its case against what Labour's Deputy Leader Grant Robertson described in his speech there as the moral failure of our prisons. No journalists turned up, hence no story. On Sunday, the Star Times gave its lead and the cover of its focus section to a prison story, the impending release of the so-called Beast of Blenheim, Stuart Murray Wilson, and the government's apparent rush to pass a new law to keep him behind bars. There was nothing wrong with the Star Times stories, but it was a perfect illustration of the way in which prison policy is generally covered, in terms of the acute rather than the systematic. In the source, Sam Mulgrew tots up the numbers.
Right now, more than 8,400 people are locked up in New Zealand's jails. More than half of them are Māori, despite just 15% of the outside population being Māori. Mostly, it's young people inside, and it's most commonly violence, sexual crime and dishonesty that sends them there. New Zealand's incarceration rate, that's prisoners per 100,000 people, is the fifth highest in the OECD, nearly 3 times higher than in Norway, where prisons look like this. So is our $92,000 per year per inmate money well spent? Well, around half of those released go back inside within 4 years, though the government says this is changing. Around 80% of crimes are committed under the influence of booze or drugs, but only a tiny 5% of offenders are sentenced to substance rehabilitation. Perhaps we should go down the lock 'em up for good path, like in the United States, where 1 in 100 adults are in prison. 400 teenagers have been sentenced to life imprisonment in Texas alone. More than 70,000 prison inmates are raped every year, and half of all African American men without a high school diploma will go to jail. The United States still criticizes China's human rights record, but despite it having more than 4 times the population, China imprisons 650,000 fewer people than the States.
I'm joined now by the author of Flying Blind, How the Justice System Perpetuates Crime and the Corrections Department Fails to Correct, Roger Brooking, and the Deputy Editor, News of the Otago Daily Times, Simon Cunliffe. Welcome to you both, gentlemen. Roger, let's start with that Howard League launch. You spoke there, you were involved with organising it. Labour's Deputy Leader, Grant Robertson, spoke there. Was there news content there, do you think?
I think there was enormous news content there. Apart from what Grant had to say, and he gave a very personal talk about his father, who apparently ended up in prison. I also made a call for a 50% reduction in the prison population in New Zealand. And I would have thought that was a pretty unusual and outrageous call to be making. And I have to say, I did invite television and print media to journalists to come, and some of them said they would, but at the end of the day, there was none of them there.
So why do you think they didn't?
Well, perhaps I can best answer that by telling you a little story about a journalist on the New Zealand Herald, who I've had quite a bit to do with over the years. I've given him many leads about stories happening within the prison system, and he would always be very interested. But then he would say to me, well, look, Roger, I'm interested. I think it's a good story, but my editor isn't. The media generally in New Zealand don't seem to care about what happens once somebody ends up in prison.
And yet, I have to say, what struck me in researching this story was we've now got the deputy leaders of both the National and Labour parties describing our prison system as a moral failure. We have a report from Treasury saying we can't keep doing this. Why is this not a story?
I think that Garth McVicar and the Sensible Sentencing Trust has had an awful lot to do with it. I think New Zealand has become, in the last 20 years maybe, a very punitive society. If you read the kind of comments that people write on websites, some of the stuff is just outrageously offensive towards... Basically, I feel that people who end up in prison are treated like third-class citizens. The Sensible Sentencing Trust scaremongers about crime. the figures we just saw indicating that 40% of those in prison are there for violence. I actually don't believe that, because certain offences which get labelled as violent, actually most of them occur under the influence of alcohol and drugs. Some of them are incredibly minor, and yet people may still end up in prison, and then when they do, they end up in those violent statistics. It may be no more than one guy I interviewed got charged with sexual assault when he patted a woman on the butt. Now, I agree, not a cool thing to do, but I don't think it...
But it goes in the statistic
as both a violent offence and as a sexual offence.
Simon, I'm going to ask you the same question. Why is this not a story when we have the establishment apparently up in arms about the state of our correction system? That, you know, basically the view is it's not working, it's a moral and fiscal failure. Why is this not a story?
Well, I think it is a story, and I agree with Roger that actually it should have been covered, and it's remiss of the media in New Zealand not to have covered it. I think that you know, when you do have people like Bill English, who last year said that prisons were a moral and fiscal failure, you know, that's a cue for the media to take an interest in what is exactly happening in our prisons.
And you wrote about it in columns, but was that reflected in the news pages?
Well, I think the opinion pages are a good place to start conversations, not necessarily always reflected in the news columns. I think the media in New Zealand, and I include newspapers in this, have been guilty of going to the first cab on the rank, which has been, as again, as Roger says, has been the Sensible Sentencing Trust. They've made a lot of noise and they've had a high profile. And I think some of our younger journalists have been captured by that lobby, and we need to explore and we need to have a conversation. That conversation, as I say, should probably start on the opinion pages, but it should find its way into the news coverage as well.
I mean, this is an interesting thing, Roger, isn't it? I think Garth McVicker is a master of this. He will always be on the end of the phone when a reporter rings, and he will always give a quote. Do you need someone like that?
I think there's something else that we actually need more than that, and that's public service television. I've just done a little bit of reading about public service television in other countries. This channel that this is on is about to close down, and when it does, there will be no government-funded public service television in New Zealand. In Finland, which is a country which has been, New Zealand compares itself with in terms of changes in prison population, they have 4 public service television channels, national television channels. They have 13 national public service radio stations and about 30 provincial ones. And in Finland, 90% of the population reads a newspaper every single day.
And what difference does that make?
I think it makes a huge difference because the public service television in Finland is apparently based on the BBC model. It's high quality, high class, investigative journalism. In New Zealand, where we have TVNZ and TV3, it's with no public service broadcasting anymore, it's driven by the dollar. It's driven by commercial interests, and I think when the charter was removed, that is just yet another step in the wrong direction for New Zealand in terms of public service television.
Now, Simon, I think this is an interesting point, because rehabilitation in itself is almost an anti-story. Someone is absorbed back into society, commits no further crime, there is no story there, is there? Is that part of the problem?
Yes, I think there's always, to a certain extent, you know, there's a fire in the building, someone shouts fire, it's a story. You know, if there isn't a fire, there's no story. You know, it is very much the way that the media works, and the media, well, if I speak specifically for newspapers, newspapers do have to sell copies of their newspaper, and that prerogative is even tougher and harder in today's world, where newspapers are under the cosh. So, yeah, I mean, it's not surprising that there are when high-profile cases do come before the courts, there is news that comes on the front page.
I actually want to ask you about a particular characteristic of your newspaper. The Otago Daily Times has always reported quite low-level court cases and small print at the back of the paper. Is there, you'll report someone getting busted for a joint. Is there a philosophy behind that?
Well, there is to a certain extent, and that's a very traditional one, that part of the punishment is public exposure. As you say, it is in small print, it is generally at the back of the paper. I think there is legislation, and certainly there's judicial attitude that suggests that exposure to the rest of the community is an important part of the punishment, and so the Otago Daily Times is, I think, probably the only remaining major newspaper in the country that maintains court reporters at every court sitting in the province, and we publish that news. We don't sensationalise it. It's a couple of lines for each person who appears, but it's partly a public duty.
What do you make of that, Roger?
I'm kind of intrigued that Simon thinks that is part of... I mean, there's tons of research that indicates that imprisonment and punishment does not act as a deterrent. So if you put stuff in the media, some horrific story and some guy gets sent to prison, and judges, when they're issuing their sentences, they generally say, I have to give you this sentence as part of deterrence and, denunciation to the community, blah, blah, blah. It makes no difference to whether or not someone, commits a crime, because most serious crimes in particular, are committed under the influence of alcohol and drugs and are totally impulsive without any concern whatsoever for consequences. By the time some guy beats up his wife or, knocks over a liquor store to get more alcohol, he isn't thinking about whether or not he's going to end up in prison. In saying that, all of this stuff is grabbed by the media and generally will end up on the front page rather than the back page. And again, it's one of the distinctions between the media in New Zealand and the media in Finland, whereby these kind of issues in Finland are not sensationalised. And that was one of the ways in which Finland managed to reduce its prison population.
And I understand there was actually a contract between the government and the newspapers to do that.
As I believe there was. And it was very effective.
Anyway, we'll take a break now and return after the break with a look at the big, quiet change in our prison system.